foreign production for foreign sales. Candy is a monopolistically competitive industry, probably with increasing returns, which means by keeping the market smaller, the candy production process, both here and abroad, are taking place at a smaller scale of production than would be economically efficient. That part we don't capture here in terms of these welfare gains and losses. This is just showing what happens to the price, producers surplus, consumer surplus, quota rents. But if we think about what's also happening within the industry and whether or not we have increasing or decreasing returns, can tell us something much, much different. There can also be effects in terms of more competition being more productive, irrespective of the economies of scale that might or might not exist. So what we see then for a large importing country, the quota may lead to either a net loss or a net gain, depending upon who receives the quota rents and how much we can drive down the world price. There is, of course, a redistribution of income. Again, consumers lose, producers gain, and the earners of the quota rents gain. Again, it could be the domestic government, could be domestic importers or other companies, or it could be foreign governments or foreign firms. We do have an effect on the world price and foreign economic welfare. Notice in this case, the effect on foreign economic welfare does not necessarily depend upon whether or not quota rents are signed abroad. Because we've affected the world price, that will affect foreign economic welfare. The quota rents, where we assign them, can also have an effect as well. So the lower world price reduces foreign economic welfare, but if we assign the quota rents to foreigners, that would bring that economic welfare back up. Okay. Any questions on import quotas? Quota rents, quota licenses? Everybody wants to own quota licenses. Yes? Yeah, yeah. So it depends on the terms of trade effect. Notice, just like a tariff. In fact, there's no difference here in terms of the letters or the picture between a tariff that reduces imports to this level and an import quota of the same magnitude. Okay, now, a nice variation on import quotas is something that's known as a voluntary export restraint. So one of the reasons that this variation came about is because import quotas are generally, one of two things happens. The exporting countries retaliate with their own import quotas or tariffs against your exports. So there's a little tete-a-tete going on. Or they file a complaint with the World Trade Organization, which really doesn't like import quotas. So the whole goal under the World Trade Organization's international trade negotiations is to get rid of import quotas, where possible convert them to tariffs, and then to try to negotiate the tariff rates down. So by and large, we don't like import quotas. So if you've got a problem with imports, one of the ways that a government can respond to that is by putting political and perhaps even economic pressure on the export country's government to put pressure on the export country's businesses, the exporters, to voluntarily, under pressure, arms twisted, but no legal binding, to reduce their exports to the country. So as an example, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the economy was in a nasty recession, kind of like today. During that period of time, one other big difference, though, is gasoline prices were soaring. This was the same time that the Iranian Revolution was taking place, and oil prices jumped to the unheard of level of $40 a barrel. I know it's unheard of today, but bring back those good old days. And what we saw, a combination of high oil prices and an economic recession pretty much devastated the domestic auto industry. Oh, yeah, sort of like today or last year, right? So car sales were collapsing. But there was something else that was taking place within the auto industry as well. Not only was the auto industry sales domestic auto industry sales collapsing, but the market share of Japanese and German cars being sold in the United States were rising very quickly. Two reasons. One is they cost a lot less than American-made cars. Actually, three reasons. They cost a lot less than American cars. Two, they were better built than American cars. And three, they were much smaller and much more fuel efficient. So what we actually saw during that period of time is increases in the sale primarily of Japanese subcompact and compact cars, and big decreases in General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford sales, most of which had big units, big cars, weighed a lot, got 6 miles to a gallon. Those were the fuel-efficient ones. The unefficient ones got 4. So Detroit, knowing that they would never be able to get import quotas put on Japanese cars, went to the U.S. government and said, rather than bailing us out, we need some breathing space to redesign and retool the industry. Does this sound familiar? To make cars that will be more effective in the current economic environment. In other words, we can't go from making giant cars to tiny cars overnight to be able to compete with the Japanese and the German small cars and the very high gasoline prices. And Washington said, well, we can't give you a bailout. We bailed out Chrysler. First time, Chrysler won. So we can't give you a bailout because we have a budget deficit of $100 billion at those times, so just put things in perspective. And we can't put on import quotas. But what we'll do is we'll go talk to the Japanese government, and we'll put as much pressure on the Japanese government as we can to get them to put pressure on Toyota, Nissan, and Honda to limit their exports of cars from Japan to the United States. And it happened. So the 3 Japanese car companies reduced their exports from something like 2.2 million units down to 1.6 or 1.7. So, right, it was voluntary on the company's part. Government inspectors were in every factory, making sure that everything was swept up and everything was clean and hygienic and all sorts of rules and regulations. But it was voluntary on the part of the exporting companies. So that was a voluntary export restraint, sometimes called voluntary restraint agreement. Now it turns out that from an economic perspective, a voluntary export restraint is just like an import quota, with a quota rents assigned to the foreigners. Now I'll tell you, just to be honest about it, I actually worked for Toyota Motor Sales USA Inc. During this period of time. It's a wonderful time to be in the Japanese car business. And as their corporate economist, I was actually asked to write the position paper as to how Toyota in the United States should respond to the fact that we were going to be able to export many fewer automobiles to the United States. So the first thing that I realized is that if you know that fewer automobiles being exported means we get to charge a higher price, right? We're going to reduce the volume of imports. So at the current price, the quantity demanded is going to exceed the quantity supplied. So it's going to push the price of our automobiles, Toyota automobiles in the United States up. So I said, okay, we raise our prices. Well, you never know exactly how much, but you start raising your prices to see what you're going to do. We also realized at that time, because of some economic studies that we had done, the demand for small cars, fuel-efficient cars in those days, was very price inelastic. Now, the cars were relatively inexpensive compared to big cars, but the demand curve was relatively inelastic. So that meant we could raise our prices more, and remember that means volume doesn't shrink very much. So margins go up. So that was the first proposition that I had. Let's raise prices. Okay, second is, okay, now, in those days as opposed to today, cars were very different. Toyota had exactly 6 models. You could buy any one of those 6 models in exactly 6 colors, period. That was it, 6 colors. Once you decided on your exterior color, that automatically determined your interior color. That's just the way it was. So you only had 3 choices. There were only 3 option choices you had. Did you want automatic transmission or manual transmission? Did you want a radio or no radio? Did you want air conditioning or no air conditioning? That was it. That was the only option loading choices that you had at that time. So what do? The margins on options are very large compared to the margins on the cars. So shortly, almost every car came with an air conditioner, a radio, and automatic transmission. Margins went up even more. Remember, the demand curve is fairly inelastic, so we could push all of this on, and prices and volumes wouldn't really suffer much. So the year after the voluntary import restraints went up, we sold, I think, 25% fewer cars. I think 20 or 25% fewer cars. Profit margins went up. Total profits went up. Well, this wasn't such a bad deal for Toyota. By the way, Honda and Nissan did exactly the same thing. I mean, this wasn't rocket science on my part to put all this together. All you had to do is open up an international trade book and look at what an import quota does, and you can figure out all the rest of it pretty easily. So that's what we ended up doing. Now, what else did Toyota and Nissan and Honda do with the big profits that they earned? So they did 2 things, 2 primary things with that. Number one is, they said, we'll build plants in the United States. So one way to get around, obviously, import quotas as well as export restraints is you just do production in the domestic country. Well, what do we find? Because the Japanese car companies, as well as the German car companies who came into the United States, they built brand new state-of-the-art factories or assembly plants. So they didn't have all the maintenance overhead that the domestic car companies had, whose factories, on average, were 35 years old. So state-of-the-art assembly plants with state-of-the-art equipment in non-union areas where wages were 25 to 40% below what the United Auto Workers were charging. So what you found is that, yes, we transplanted it here. It cost Toyota more money to make a car in the United States than it did in Japan, but it also cost us a lot less to make a Toyota car in the U.S. than it cost GM, Ford, or Chrysler to make a car in the U.S. Not only in dollar terms, in man-hour terms. We were much, much more efficient. So, of course, that means that the domestic car companies continue to be under very significant competitive pressures. The other thing, though, that the car companies did with their we're not supposed to call them excess profits, with their voluntary export restraint rents was to invest in a new class of automobiles, which all 3 of the car companies decided that they would not call Toyota, Nissan, and Honda, but rather they would call Lexus, Infiniti, and Acura. That was the birth of the Japanese luxury car market. And if you've looked at what happened to the domestic luxury car market, it's basically disappeared. General Motors now tries to tell everybody that a Buick is a luxury car. Well, when I was your age, a Buick would never have been thought of as a luxury car. The luxury car was a Cadillac. And Cadillac is, what, 20% of its former self in terms of sales volume? So one has to be careful about the kind of consequences one looks for when you ask for import restraint. There can be all sorts of unintended consequences. Now, there is good news in all of this. Toyota's profits were so big that I got a very nice bonus that paid for my elder daughter's college education. And she managed to cram 4 years of college education into 6 years. So it was a nice bonus. Okay, so, yes? Before they made this facility in the U.S., Ooh, I don't know that we ever calculated that. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that. So one of the things to remember about voluntary export restraints, we're assigning the rents, they're called VER, voluntary export restraint rents rather than quota rents, to foreigners. As we saw with import quotas, when the rents are assigned to foreigners, it's an unambiguous loss to the country, regardless of whether you're a small country or you're a big country. It just doesn't matter. It's a bad deal in terms of economic welfare. Okay, real quickly, just some other things. These are all kind of boring, so I'm going to go through them very quickly, because our giants are going to play here pretty soon. Just a few other things where we can interfere with imports coming into a country. One is known as local content requirements. By the way, we have this in the auto industry. If you go down and you look at an automobile, look at a domestically produced automobile, when you look at the sticker, it'll tell you what percentage of that was made in the United States, what percentage of the value added came from Canada, what percentage of the value added came from Mexico, and what percentage of the value added came outside those 3 countries. So that's a domestic content requirement, requiring a certain amount of the input into a product to be domestically produced. Notice that is basically protection for the parts manufacturers, right? If you're going to make a unit, now you've got to use a certain percentage of the domestically produced parts. But it is not an absolute cap on the amount of imports. If you increase your total production, you can increase your imports as well. So we're not limiting the amount of imports, only the proportion of imports that can be included in the final product. And the pricing here just gets all mishmashed because it generally ends up just as being the average price of the imported goods and the domestically produced goods, and just gets thrown into the final retail product. Okay, and there's no government revenue. National procurement policies. These are policies that basically say that the government or a heavily government influenced or controlled industry cannot buy or a certain amount of imports or a certain share of its consumption of goods and services must be domestically produced. A number of states in the United States, New Jersey is the big example, have, Illinois I think recently did this, passed laws that said that their government call centers could not be outsourced to India. Because, of course, we lose jobs here and blah, 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 blah. So that's what we call a national procurement policy. Europe has been particularly egregious in this area because most of the big telecommunications companies or industries and utilities, gas and electric utilities, are either owned by the government or heavily influenced by the government still. And they've had procurement policies that say if you want to buy switching equipment in the telecommunications industry, it has to be from a European firm, or 80% has to be from European firms. So those things get in there to limit imports as well. Health and safety standards. We'll talk about these more later when we get into some of the environmental and health and safety concerns later in the semester. But these, what we're talking about here, are not the legitimate health and safety standards that can be put into place to protect the consumers of the products, but rather the egregious health and safety standards that are sort of over the top, where you're asking for degrees of purity or degrees of evidence that are well beyond anything that would normally be accepted in terms of using imported goods versus domestic goods. And then finally, red tape barriers, where you just put a lot of administrative controls in place. My favorite one of these was about 15 years ago. There was a dispute between France and China on the importation of video cassette recorders. And people don't even have those anymore, right? So they were coming into China, and there was some big dispute, and I don't even remember the disputes. And so France and China were negotiating on this issue. The Chinese were stonewalling it, and so France said, okay, all imports of Chinese video cassette recorders must come through the port of Lyon. Lyon is in the middle of France. It's not a seaport. So everything, I think it was Lyon. If Lyon is a seaport, it was some town in the middle of France. So the ship would come in, they would unload all the containers on port, they'd have to wait for trucks or trains, which by the way magically took a lot longer to get there, and then they would put them up to the city in the middle of France, which by the way only had 2 customs inspectors, only one working at a time. So not very many Chinese video cassette recorders actually passed through customs and actually got into the marketplace. The Chinese backed down because they wanted to sell a lot of videotape recorders in France, and the dispute, whatever, again, I don't even remember what the dispute is, but I thought the red tape barriers were very, very clever. Okay, have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday, and go Giants! Oh, and Bears too.